So hello friends, how are you? Welcome to Mentor Vikas channel, and in this video we are going to understand how the context will work in a Qwik application, right? So what problem basically we are going to solve here? We are going to solve the problem of prop drilling, right? So as in Qwik also, if I have that nested level of components to pass the data from level 1, level A to level I have to pass the value from one to another, then from this to this, then from this to this, and we have to pass uh, this props from each and every level, okay, to access this data to this ith component, right? So this is what we call prop drilling, and to avoid that prop drilling, we have a solution, that is that context. Okay, so it is also the same. It is also going to act as the same as we use in React, if you are familiar with it, and if you are not, then just you have to understand this. Context is something which basically solve this prop drilling problem. Okay, so what basically it means, it simply means that if I want to access the value of access the value that I had declared here in a component, and if I want to use that into f component, I don't have to pass the props from this to this and from this to this. Okay, I can simply pass the value from here to here. Okay, and if I have to access the value or the state managed in a component, and I want to use it into I component, I can simply access directly that value in my I component without have to pass props at each and every level. Okay, so let's see how we can do this by using context API, right? So as you can see here, we have imported 5 things. Okay, we have imported 5 things, and all are from builder.io/Qwik. Okay, so let's understand what are these components. So what are these, and how we can, and why we had imported all these, right? So let's start with this component. So this component we had imported just to create our components, right? So our Qwik components in our application. So as you can see, we uses this component part here to create this component. This is the parent component, and this is our child component, and we also use this component to create our child component, right? So here we just use this component to create our component. Second one is to use store. Use store is used to manage the state value, right? So here we have a state value, and we named it like user data, and here we have a user data state value, but here we not use that use store. Okay, so basically we uses the use store to manage the state variable, okay, so the state data at our parent component. And finally, what we had done here, we had used the context API to access the value which we had defined here in our parent component in to our child component. Okay, so we don't redeclare this value, but we're simply trying to access this value which we had defined here. Okay, so to do this, as you can see, as I had already told you, we use context, right? So as you can see here, we had use context, right? So let's go step by step so that you can simply understand what we had done here. Okay, so the first thing that we have to do is to create an context ID, right? So how we can use that, create a context ID. So to create a context ID, I just simply have to use this function. Okay, that is that create context ID, right? And this method is provided by the Qwik itself. Okay, so to create this, to use this, I just have to create a variable. For in our case, we had just taken a variable that is ctx, right? You can use anything. It doesn't, you don't have to just use ctx, you can choose any variable you want. And finally, I just uses this context create context ID, and within this we had just declare that what is the value that it is going to output. Okay, so in our case, I just define that. Okay, the value that I am trying to pass with this context ID is count. Okay, and that count is a number. Okay, so this part is the JavaScript, it's a TypeScript part. Okay, so here we had just defined its type, right? And here you have to choose a name. Okay, and here we have to choose a name that could be anything, and this name is your identifier. Okay, so this identifier should be unique. So what basically I mean simply that if you are it is not that in your application you just have one context id, and there could be several context id at different levels, right? And to specify that, okay, which context id, so that each and every context id is different from each other, you have to give an unique identifier. Okay, so that name which you had seen is a kind of unique identifier to this context id, right? So you have to choose so if you declare that 5 different context ids, so you have to choose this name different for each, right? So that it can't produce any error or confusion to your Qwik application, right? So initially we had created a context id, okay, by using that create context id, and you just simply have to pass an string, right? Second, if you just see here, to pass that value from parent, so from parent to the child, we uses that use context provider. Okay, so this use context provider is a hook, right? And by using this, I just specify this, okay, use this id as an context id. So here we had specify the data, specify the id, that first variable or the first argument is the id. Okay, so in our case our id is ctx, so we had just mentioned here, okay, the id is ctx, and we linked this data which we want to pass with this provider, with this ctx provider, right? We had just linked this data, and to link this data we just have to pass data as in second argument. Okay, so the first argument is our key as our id, and the second argument is our data. Okay, so here I just want to pass this data to this data here. Okay, so what basically it does, it basically taken this data to this place, right? So here I just passes this count value like this, and that is why we had just defining the type of that count, and we specify that count is a number, right? Okay, so finally this is all just you have to do, and as you can see at this child component you don't have to pass any prop. Okay, so all of the other task has been done by or managed by this use context provider. Okay, so finally if you are just willing to access this data which you had passes by the context api. Okay, so if you are just willing to use that data, you just have to use context. Okay, so finally you can use that use context, and you just specify the id name. Okay, so that id that is associated with this data, so in our case the id is ctx, right? So we just specify, okay, that id is the ctx, and by using this id it basically capture this data, that is that user data. So finally this user data is being collected over here and being stored in this user data variable. Okay, so now you can simply access this user data into your child component without using props. Okay, so one thing I want to redeclare here, that even though in our previous example it was just there was a parent and a child. Okay, even though if you have this nested level of component, from example from a to c, then c to b, then b to I, you don't have to pass as prop. Okay, you just have to do the same thing which we had done at the second level to our ith level, right? And that data will be easily available to your last nested component. Okay, by the same way as we had accessed here, right? So I think now we have a clear understanding of how you can access this access the data from the parent component to child component, and why it is necessary to create an context id, right? Because by using this context id you will be able to access the right data, because in your Qwik application you can create multiple providers. Okay, so there should not be any conflict between one to another providers. Okay, so for that you have to create an id, right? Great. So I think this is enough for this video, and soon I will meet you in next video where I will tell you about the serialization and how you can use no serialization in your application, and what are the places where you should think of to use no serialization. Okay, so let's meet you in our next video. So till then, have a nice day and goodbye.